Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Of course.
Let me start by saying I'm recording the conversation. It's an interview. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
All right, good. Thank you much. What I'd like to begin with always is start off with a kind of, how is it that you've come to the kind of focus you have, the passion that's driving you, why it is you're in the space you are with your research and your work to help kids?
Okay. I'll give a
brief is fine, whatever's comfortable for you.
A brief version of a very long story that began actually many years ago when I was in a Peace Corps-like mission, if you can call it that. I was to go to a Native American reservation, and everything fell through, and suddenly I landed in a Filipino mission school in Hawaii, and it was just literally with just the shortest amount of time. First, I think I'm going to North Dakota, and next I'm ending up in tropical Hawaii. It was not respectable in terms of political cachet, but it was,
it's perks, huh?
It was too beautiful. But the poverty, the needs were just extraordinary. And when I began teaching and was assigned to a third grade with 10 different languages in it, kids with every possible need, from fetal alcohol syndrome. Certainly bilingualism was a big factor. One child was retarded. Many kids had various kinds of literacy special needs, and they were all mine. And I just had a year that transformed my life. I became so aware of the consequences, the sequelae of what not learning how to read would mean for these kids in terms of the rest of their life.
Wow.
The little village that we had these single rocking chairs. And I said, why all these single rocking chairs? And they were the Filipino men who could never earn enough money to bring their families over as promised from the Philippine Islands. And they were like the living testimony to all the failed hopes and exploitation, absolute exploitation of these people. And they couldn't read. Their children were having all kinds of struggles. And I knew if I couldn't do it, the lives were going to be changed. And I also knew if I could, I wasn't certainly going to prevent everything else from going wrong, but that I would have eliminated a very key factor in their not meeting their potential. And that year was just, it just literally, David, I was an English major. I had a master's degree. I had my PhD set up to become a Rilke scholar in poetry, and it just snapped every decision I had made before in two. And I came back to the mainland and literally just immediately or almost immediately went into a program that prepared me to switch completely. The following year I went to Harvard to the reading laboratory, and I just was determined from that moment on that I was going to use my life to help kids through learning how to read. That was my vehicle. Ensure that they're going to at least have a shot at their potential. That was not going to hold them back. And that experience at Harvard's reading lab and introduced me to all kinds of different approaches to the problem. I had been thinking about it more or less from almost a sociological viewpoint. When I got to Harvard, I became, as a surprise to me, here I am in English, I became a scientist. I became totally involved in neuroscience because it really seemed to me that we were going to get answers the likes of which we had never had before in education, from understanding what is going on in the reading brain. And so that became my quest, if you will, to understand what it is the brain does when we read and how we can translate that knowledge, that fundamental theoretical knowledge, into very practical applications in terms of diagnosis, assessment, and most important to me, intervention. So 20 plus years later, I now have become very involved in the design and creation and testing through the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development of the best forms of intervention for different kinds of children with their different kinds of reading issues. And it's been a long journey. It's been a theoretically exciting one. I have to say, intellectually, I have never, ever had one day of boredom. And it's made my life very satisfied, if you will, in terms of I feel like everything I do and learn has something that makes the life of some kids better. And it feels like a great way to live a life. So that's my story.
It's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I like how you connected the dots there. And, it's surprising. Maybe it's not surprising to you, but a lot of the people that I talk to have had some experience in their life that brought home the incredible importance of this in a way that there's such a social lack of understanding.
Yeah. Well, mine began actually in the social, political realm, and then it just didn't let go of me. And at that moment, David, I so wanted to study poetry. And instead, I, became a scholar who knows what happens when a poet retrieves a word. So it's still intellectually a lot of fun, but it is very different from where I began.
That's excellent. Thank you. So what would you say were the most important findings or the most important things that have come out of your research into the neuroscience of reading that are not generally well understood?
Okay. The history of reading disabilities, I'll use the word dyslexia, some people use it, some people don't, is such a fascinating one because it's like a case study in science patterns, the desire for parsimony among scientists, and the refusal of the human brain to be typed in one way. And what you see in this history is one researcher after another seizing on what is in front of them and saying, that's what dyslexia is.
Overgeneralizing.
That's what causes it. And it's really the most overworked and even platitudinous analogy in the world. But the blind men and the elephant describe the history of dyslexia research.
And the Sufi key story.
Exactly. And if you just put together even only the names of dyslexia, you'll see one hypothesis is visual, one is memory, one is verbal, one is auditory, you just go on the list. Well, if you put them all together, or if, I'm doing this in a book now, I just put them on the brain. Just put those names on the brain, and you see a rude cartography of reading. In other words, if it can go wrong, it does, and at one point in the history of dyslexia has been called the major explanation for dyslexia. Now, the modern history has been punctuated by really different, very technologically sophisticated approaches, including neurosciences and also including a lot of wonderful work done in an area called psycholinguistics. And 1970s, there was a great a set of researchers at Haskins Lab in Yale, and they they were really beginning a whole new approach to understanding dyslexia by looking at the linguistic foundations of reading breakdown. And that began one of the single best hypotheses we've ever had, which is that the phonological system in language, that is our ability to hear, to discriminate the sounds, the smallest sounds called phonemes in words, is a fundamental necessity in learning to read and a fundamental source of why some children can't learn to read. And that began what's called the phonological deficit hypothesis, which has really been just the most successful of explanations to date. Now, my research began while that was in its zenith. I was beginning my work, and at the same time I was very influenced by that. I was equally influenced by neurosciences, which was then called neurological or neuropsychological studies, and we were beginning to see that there was this one very odd phenomenon that children who were going to become dyslexic were always exhibiting, whether they were 5 or 6 or 7, and that was a failure to be able to name. It's so simple, to name things they saw at the same speed that other children were doing that. Well, naming seems very simple, but it's actually a very difficult set of underlying processes. So my mentor, Martha Denkla, and her mentor, neurologist Norman Geschwin, were responsible for really getting the field to think differently, if you will. And in the beginning, people said, oh, well, naming speed, that is just another kind of phonology. You need to be able to retrieve a phonological label, and for a while that satisfied me. And then I began to see kids who had no phoneme issues in other areas, and yet they had this. And
you mean in terms of their ability to articulate themselves on the fly, that would demonstrate that they had good phoneme processing, but they couldn't name, which has got an associational component?
Well, that's really close.
Okay.
It's just, I'll just be slightly more technical by saying that when we do all our tests, we had explicit measures of these phoneme awareness skills that everybody says were the most important ones. And we were seeing that some kids didn't have that, but they had naming speed. Well, if they're both the same, they should have both, you see? And they weren't exhibiting that. And that began us thinking, there are so many issues beyond the phoneme, which includes the visual system, it includes the retrieval system, it includes the speed with which the brain puts its systems together.
Yeah, that's the center of my interest.
Well, that was what we got just fixated on. That's not the same as phoneme awareness. So we then began to really get in-depth understandings of naming speed and the speed with which not only that you name, but the speed with which you read, and how that fluency in reading is really important, not for speed as speed, but for the brain's ability to do those easy processes fast enough to allocate time to comprehension.
Right. So the lower levels are operating efficiently, and there's sufficient bandwidth to be reflective and comprehensive.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's what we were beginning to understand. So this tiny little innocuous naming speed test opened up a world of understanding about how important all of these individual processes are that go beyond the phoneme, and how important reading fluency is for comprehension. So that puts you into literally a different ballpark from the implication of the phonological deficit, which is that you work on words and phonemes. You get the kids to be able to recognize words and read, decode them, and everything else is going to happen naturally. Well, it isn't that simple if my hypothesis and my colleague Pat Bowers and others, certainly we weren't the only two, but in the early 90s, we were kind of John the Baptist types.
Yeah, I know the type.
That was a little hard going there for a while. Then people started thinking, oh my gosh, we know they're right. We still believe it's phonology, but there is no doubt that there are these kids, and here's where what we call the double deficit hypothesis comes in. There are these kids who have single deficits in phoneme awareness, single deficit in naming speed without phoneme, and then double deficit kids who have both. And the kids who have both have reading fluency and comprehension issues for different reasons than the kids who have only phoneme awareness.
And therefore need different interventions to differentiate the kind of...
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. And that was the whole point. If you believe that everything is phonology, you have only one intervention. If you believe that there can be different reasons for this naming speed, then you have to really make sure your intervention is going after all those different things and putting it in the intervention plans. And so my work then in the mid-90s, funded by Reed Lyons Group at NICHD, was funding us to begin to design whole new interventions based on our knowledge of both the reading brain and our knowledge of linguistics, all the things that go into what we do when we try to retrieve words in time, both at the phoneme level, the word level, and the whole connected text level. So we began an intervention called RAVO, which really emphasizes all that we knew and all that we are evolving knowledge about how the brain processes words. And we've got now, considerable data that support us showing that the kids who have these naming speed and fluency issues are very much better served by this RAVO fluency program, and the kids who have only a phonology are well served by only phonology-oriented programs. So our data is showing both the efficacy of our work and also the needs that these other kids have that go beyond the conventional phonological programs.
Excellent, excellent. Let's go to rapid naming for a moment.
Sure.
I mean, most children seem to be able to name the things that are around their world relatively easy compared to the challenge of reading.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? But there's a difference in reading that comes from the need to be able to name or to deal with letters and their letter sounds and what have you, and stick them together fast.
That's right.
Right? To bundle them together into
put all of that together.
Right.
You're quite correct. There's something called orthographic representation. We know a lot about phoneme representation, but we don't know as much about what we're doing when we rapidly make patterns of letters that are specific to our language versus another. For example, in German, you would see SCHR very frequently. In English, you would never see it. The German child makes an orthographic representation, has a pattern.
That was a structural unit.
Yeah, it's a unit, and we don't have that unit. And in English, you have these units that are specific, and part of RAVO is teaching those units explicitly, trying to make them faster and faster.
So you're trying to make subunit visual recognition happen fast.
Perfect. So one piece of RAVO is devoted to making orthographic chunks automatic in the kids. Another piece is devoted to the experience of entertaining different meanings of a word. A lot of our kids are almost penalized because not only are they slower at putting those letters together, they're slower at retrieving the meanings. And so a lot of them only have one, missing the point or missing the joke or missing the poem, because they don't have that rapid retrieval of multiple meanings. nor did their system in the beginning allow them to.
Are you connecting that to kind of the overall ecology of processing and bandwidth again, or?
Well, it is very similar. At the same time we're teaching orthographic patterns, we're teaching them a set towards multiple meanings of words. We're teaching them how words can be used differently in syntax by adding on morphemes that are in patterns, ed, ing, s, ly, all those are, or prefixes, pre, re, all those things. We want them to see them, but we also want them to know how they change the meaning. So it's all in there.
In the case of, back to rapid naming for just a minute, have you found where you think the processing bottleneck is relative to, difficulties with rapid naming?
Great question. I wish, I really wish. We have a lot of very highfalutin experiments. Some of them are literally speech synthesis, where we computerize the speech stream and we look at exactly where the differences are. Is it in like the visual, if you remember those rapid naming tests, there's 5 lines of 10 symbols, like so 10 letters, and each of those letters are repeated 2 times on a line, and there's only 5 letters being repeated 10 times for a group of 50 letters, so it's not like a big deal of knowledge. But at the end of a line, if the visual system is slow, you're going to be able to detect it in the amount of time that a student takes from one line to the next. That would be one logical hypothesis. Another is articulation. So you would measure articulation. There's all these different hypotheses.
So you could use like Keith Rayner's work to differentiate what part's visual from what part's stuttering up in the articulatory circuitry. Right.
We're trying to eliminate where we can. And in fact, we are not seeing gross visual differences at the end of the line. We think that at the level of that there are some differences in some kids, but not all kids. But what we do see is the bottleneck is the time in between the articulation of one symbol and the beginning of the processing of the other. So everything that's in that gap, not the visual line, not articulation, but everything that's in that gap.
Kind of recovery and reset from articulation.
Yeah, all that comes before, disinhibition from the previous stimulus, setting it up. Here's where seeing or visual processes can come in, but also hooking it up then to the phonological label. All those kinds of processes that go into access and retrieval and perception, those are in there. That's where the time in the speech stream research shows us that's where your money is. But that includes many different areas. So then you have to go into each one of those. And here's where the field rightly is reluctant to get that complex. We aren't reluctant. We are going to pursue it until we feel like we know which child has which area. But in fact, it means that you have to have a pretty doggone sophisticated set of tests to be able to say, well, this child has all of those areas slower, or this child has only one area that's slower. So what you have, if you will, it's like we've narrowed it down to a set of processes. We've eliminated some things like articulation and gross eye movement, but in that subset, we still don't know which child has which or whether they have all of the above. And that's where I think the field is right now.
Excellent. Let's climb back up for a minute and ask for, you used with some hesitancy the word dyslexia.
I use it always, but I think the world sometimes has more difficulty. Not my world, but I think this is more for public radio, is that correct? Or
we may appear in different venues. We're certainly going to do a transcript of this, which will be available online, and this may lead to, if it works for you, an on-camera video.
Yeah.
We will be doing a television program, a DVD series. Back to the dyslexia, I mean, it's such a overgeneral term. I mean, it's a term that's kind of holy grail. Pick your definition and apply it.
Yeah.
And you also use the term, at least on your website, developmental dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's particularly interesting to me in teasing out in these conversations is, what do we know about dyslexia that's kind of neurobiological innate versus what is a consequence of the learning environment that children are growing in?
Well, that's one of the interesting things about naming speed. We're finding, at least by and large, this is, I have to say by and large, that our kids who have a lot of environmental issues, they do not have differences on naming speed, so that on things like color or numbers, as long as they know their numbers and colors, and that's not for all kids the case.
Mm-hmm.
There really are extraordinary differences when you walk into kindergarten. But let's say not kindergarten, but second grade. You find the kids who have some of the phoneme awareness issues, that can certainly go with environmental, but naming speed seems more hardwired. You've got some real issues that you're picking up here that are there forever. And in the most compensated dyslexic adult that we've studied, you still see these differences. And these are some Nobel Prize winners.
Right. Huh. You familiar with Hart Risley's research?
Oh, gosh. There's the Todd and Risley studies on this, the 30 million word gap at 3. There's no question that makes such a huge...
I would think that's the other side of that, although that doesn't track as well as how many, what the actual articulations for the children are.
Yeah.
Is that, the more that you do it, the faster you get at it.
Yeah.
And that there would be a parallel to the... that would approach here.
In kindergarten, I think you still have that, but when, let's say the child's been in the system for 2 years,
mm-hmm.
at the level of naming a color or number, you really are getting much closer no matter what your environmental input, unless it's just disaster. So we have this suspicion that this is and suspicion based on data, that if you look at what we, I just hate this word, but the field historically has used terms like garden variety poor reader or non-discrepant poor reader to describe children whose environment and intellectual quotient on an intelligence test or something like that is commensurate with their reading. Well, I don't like those terms, but let's just say environmental reasons, just for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
Those kids on our tests look like every other kid on naming speed in grade 2. But in grade 1, grade kindergarten, they're a little down, but they're really getting as close as can be by grade 2, even grade 1. But the kids among them who are environmental and dyslexic, in my terms,
mm-hmm.
their naming speed is going to be depressed, down through 8th grade, and now we know into adulthood. It is a fundamental difference.
Okay. Now let me see if we can't get some just percentage of population overlay if possible.
Yeah.
We've got a consensus between Lyon and Wendorf and Sally Shaywitz and others that seem to say that we're talking about 5 to 6% that have some kind of an innate or neurobiological structural level difficulty, and that the large balance, the primary difference from them is the learning environment they're in and the kind of instruction they're receiving.
You mean the balance of the percentages that people have would be more environmental? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, Reed Lyon's pretty famous for 95% of the kids that have trouble with reading are instructional casualties.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
I don't go to.
Well, that's a bigger figure probably than he. You know, Reed has sometimes. I really respect Reed so much. So he's just sometimes he may exaggerate.
Yeah, okay.
Let's just say that. And I love his exaggerations because they always help us. And sometimes they help us by having to clarify things he has said. So,
well, Wendorf, to whatever degree he's independent, says that his research on the amount of innate neurobiological learning disabilities happens to be at the same number.
Yeah. Well, I think that most people would say between 5 and 10%.
Okay.
Closer to 5, but between 5 and 10% of a given population would have some kind of neurobiological foundation for the dyslexia. We know increasingly about the genetic components. We're not there yet, but there's such rich genetic knowledge going on. Now, does the rest, I think in any given place, you've really got you've got a lot of different factors going on, and environmental is a big word that I would prefer to parse.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
So the parsing that I would do includes what are the children who are bilingual or English language learners? What effect does that have? What of our children, and here's an issue that a social linguist colleague and I are working on. His name is Chip Gidney, and he'd be a wonderful person for you to interview.
Okay, thank you.
He's a person here at Tufts who is working on African American children who speak African American vernacular English.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have standard English as a dialect and vernacular English as another dialect. Well, what are some of the issues that you have when the two dialects are so close, and yet you are learning to read in one of those?
Whose vocabulary and nuances are quite different.
Yes, but also at the phoneme level.
Yes.
So we're really looking at some of the phonological difficulties of some of the kids who speak African American vernacular English, and we're hoping like heck that some of that research will point the way to understanding what's going on with that particular percentage. Then you have your children of poverty who, like your Todd and Risley study, have not had the same deck of cards that the other kids have. They're walking into kindergarten totally different linguistically.
Well, again, Risley's work, my understanding was that it really came down to the amount of talking going on.
That's right.
And that it didn't matter whether somebody was rich and taciturn or poor and talkative, that the language exposure had two influences. One, in the field of linguistic exercise, developing vocabulary, developing processing speed, developing phonemic awareness, differentiation, all that.
Yep.
And at the same time that the greater number of words tended to be of a more positive affect.
Yeah, it's amazing what all that work means. And Catherine Snow and David Dickinson and others have also shown, dinner talk. Dinner talk is important.
Yeah.
How we talk, how much we speak, what do we do with our language around children. This is so important for our preschool teachers to know. I had one wonderful dissertation on that, and there's so many things that we should be doing that we can do easily, but that are not happening, and that's one of them.
Right.
The development of language in our children. And I think the pediatrician can play a role here too. My hope has always been, and some people are doing this, that when you have your well visits, you also have a little set of books or other things that the mother or father or caretaker can take home and use with their children at each juncture of each year, those first 5 years. So that's a really important potential asset for our society that we don't use enough.
Right, right. No, there's a lot of different programs that are moving in that direction.
Yeah,
and parents and teachers.
Everything we can do.
Right. So back to the naming thing, right?
Okay.
Rapid naming. What percentage of the population do you think has a trouble with that?
Well, you know, this is we're doing pie charts, if you will, of all the kids who have reading disabilities. And we are finding that in our let's say in that 5 to 10% who've been identified as really having hardcore impaired reading issues, now here's it's tricky to follow, but it's actually simple. One large portion, 50% approximately, has what we call double deficit, are issues both in phoneme awareness and naming speed. So that's, first hold on to that, so that classic dyslexic has both. But then you can also have children who have only phoneme awareness issues and not all the accoutrement of the naming speed. So that's about 25%, or let's say 20-ish.
Right.
Another 20-ish have only naming speed issues. They go on to have fluency and comprehension, of course, but for other reasons than the phoneme awareness single deficit. But now here's the tricky part. If you add the two, the double with the single, you'll see that you have approximately 70 to 75% of the population of these kids having phoneme awareness, and the same is true for naming speed.
I see.
So that's where it gets a little tricky.
No, I understand. Good.
And then if you add my numbers up, you'll see there's a missing 10%. And that 10% are other factors. And we don't have them understood yet.
Okay.
So by no means do I want anyone to think that naming speed and phoneme awareness are the only things that can predict, or that the only patterns of deficit. If it were that simple, we wouldn't have this rich heterogeneity out in front of us.
Right, right. Well, I asked this to just kind of get a baseline for the next stage of the conversation, which is, though I'm touched and moved and feel great compassion for the 5 to 10% in this range that are having this problem, I'm also, and perhaps at an even greater degree, concerned about the larger extent of reading-related difficulties, which are outside the strict boundaries here.
That's right.
And I mean, we talk about 87% of African-American fourth-grade children reading below fourth grade.
That's right.
There's emotional consequences. There's cognitive consequences. And so in that sense, this learning to read process is learning disabling to a vast dimension of our population.
That's right. That's right.
And that's my main concern.
Well, here's there's several things that we need out there. We need programs that are developing these language skills from preschool on. That's first. Second, in kindergarten, we need to have a lot of work done on phoneme awareness in the school language, which is English, standard American English.
Right.
This has got to be, because the kids have a dialect that's too close. So they're not, it makes the English learning even tougher.
Right. Have you encountered Jean Van Keulen's work?
No, I haven't.
Okay, all right. Just somebody who studied the difference in the black community street language and nuances of talk versus the vocabulary level that's available to readers when they take off, and the problems that those things,
Well, how do I spell her last name?
Van Keulen, K-U-L-E-N. She's in San Francisco, was the director of San Francisco's Head Start, and also a professor at USF.
Okay. Well, that's a good lead, because my colleague Chip Goodney and I we're especially Chip. This has got to be one of the next big, in my mind, next big directions in this work.
Well, one of the questions.
It's not enough. If you can do something about saying, the paucity of work in this area is an outrage.
Yeah.
I mean, Reed has supported us, I shouldn't say Reed, I should, but...
That's okay, I know what you meant.
But NICHD has supported this direction in our research. We have 50% of our sample as African American kids, so that can facilitate us learning about this. We're doing transcripts and tapes, and we hope to get one of our next directions is to get a grant to study this in far more depth and really understand what are some of the treatment differences with the kids in the different programs that we are using with them, just in terms of kids, not kids who are African American, but kids who are African American and speak vernacular English versus those who don't.
Right.
So, I mean, and we've controlled for everything, SES, IQ, etc. So this study will, this kind of direction of study will, I think, help us go some distance. And I want to say one other thing. Jean Shaw, the great reading researcher at Harvard, who's also one of my advisors, right before she died, she called me and knew of this direction that Chip and I are trying to take and said, this is the single most important problem in reading research today, and not enough people know it.
Yeah.
So if you can do in your work, David, something to highlight or spotlight how this 87% of kids is struggling under our noses, and the status quo is not working.
Yeah, that's my greater concern, as I said, and it concerns me at a couple of levels that we can, somewhat start to get to, because I'm interested in cycling back to the issue of timing and how that relates to all of this. We're talking about 64% of the 12th graders below proficient in the country, across the board, all races, and one of the, there's one conversation which is the neurological construction of this virtual reality experience we call reading, and the unnatural to our organism artificial challenges that are involved in getting the brain to assemble this.
New circuits. I mean, the whole thing is new circuits are required for the brain. It is not natural. It is an unnatural, novel set of connections.
Right. You might even say that there's artificial infrastructure that has to develop in the brain to do this.
That's right. But we are poised to be able to do that. That's one of the wonderful aspects of our brain. But some brains have it easier than others.
Yes, and that comes back to there's so much of that variation, which we might say is neurobiological, and then there's so much of that variation that has to do with how the environment has exercised the fundamental individual layers that have to congeal and work together at this next stage.
You've got it.
Okay, relative to that, one of the missing pieces, and every neuroscientist I've talked to agrees with how important it is, but very few people have got any traction or handle on, is the role of affect in and upon cognition at the high-frequency assembly levels that we're talking about.
Yeah, there's no question that's one. I will be so bold as to say that is the secret weapon of my program.
Really?
Absolutely. The big E in RAVO is for engagement. Engagement in language. It is imperative. If you don't have it, if the teacher doesn't engage, and it's engagement not only of the learner, I have to say, David, it's engagement by the teacher as well. We want to make that really as clear as we can. You need an engaged teacher, you need an engaged learner, because that affect component, whether you call it motivation, engagement, I don't care what you call it, it can make or break learning of those increments that are necessary.
Yeah, it's what's creating the span of attention.
That's exactly right, and we have to hook them.
Well, it goes both ways. I mean, clearly, cognition is doing what there's an affective interest driving.
That's right.
Right.
And look at the brain, how it's structured from the start. What is happening, even in the wiring of a baby, that in terms of circuits, the amygdala is one of the first areas that is being wired and is learning to work more, or not more, but before the hippocampus. Well, what is the amygdala doing? It's involved in emotion and emotion plus memory.
Right.
And so you have, even from the very beginning, the key importance of affect. In this respect, Freud was right.
Did you ever encounter Sylvan Tompkins?
Nope.
Affect, imagery, and consciousness?
Nope.
It's a model of affect and its relationship to cognition that I find really an important one, and that, that not only speaks to affect as this biological precursor to emotion.
Yeah, oh, well, that's certainly, I agree with that.
But also speaks to the effect that affect switching has on cognitive entrainment, or at least that's my interpretation.
That's interesting. I don't know the work, so I'll have to take a look. But there's another person that you might be interested in who is equally passionate about that, and that's David Rose. He and I went to Harvard together years ago, and were one of the few people who were trying to put neuroscience together back then. And it's so curious. He's now the head of a huge company called CAST here in Massachusetts, and he's really modeling in his computerized educational offerings cognition plus affect plus, obviously his knowledge of neurology, but he's always talking about the combination.
Right,
so
right.
If you want another person.
I will. I'll seek him out. Thank you. I'm aware of him, and you just pushed me over the edge to reach in touch with
Again, he and I really believe in an engaged learning as a key to cognition.
Yeah, some of my early work was what I used to call the cycle of engagement, and in particular, what causes the erosion of attention that breaks down engagement. How can
I should be reading that. Seriously.
Well, the interesting thing to me is that if you go to affect theory, what it says is that as we become frustrated with relation to our intention, our affective interest, then that causes a shift in affect from interest into shame.
Oh, my.
And that as soon as the interest starts to shift, two things happen. Number one, the affective power to sustain the entrainment of cognition on the task has been dissipated.
Yes.
And there's a bandwidth division because now we're starting to become self-conscious.
Wow, and boy.
So that's stuttering up reading.
You look at our kids. You see that on their faces.
Exactly. So one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we get a facial view? How do we monitor what's happening on the inside, the outside, and then correspond all of that to the kinds of ambiguity challenges that children are experiencing in the nested levels of ambiguity that are involved in reading?
Well, that's a fancier way of saying what we're trying to do when we teach these RAVO lessons, because we have increments that change fairly rapidly to both maintain interest and engagement, but most importantly, allow success.
Yes.
So we get success and engagement together, that's the reciprocal, and then we switch to the next, and then the next, and then the next, so that
you're ratcheting up, staying inside a threshold of enough success feeding back.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're doing.
That's excellent. This negative consequence of it's really clear as we go around and talk to teenagers, adults of all ages and ranges about their difficulties with reading, that they develop at a higher level, psychological level, an aversion to reading.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Well, who wouldn't?
Of course, it's a perfectly natural thing. But if we take that and break that down into kind of more microtime processes involved in the assembly down below, we could say that what happens if we develop a pre-conscious shame aversion to the feeling of confusion involved in learning to read?
I haven't thought in these terms, but as you say them, there is no question that's our enemy, shame. And it happens so soon in the process because they know who the bluebirds are and the sparrows. Everyone knows who is whom.
Right.
And they know that they should be able to do that, and they think that if they can't, they're dumb. Ergo, shame, and the whole, almost John Steinbeckian cycle, you know, the rejected child kicks the cat, blah, blah, blah.
We call it the downward spiral of shame.
Yeah, that's it.
And the interesting and the most important thing is not just the surface observation we can make of people that are struggling here, but the high-frequency cognitive implications, because as people become more and more guarded about the shame, the threshold with which they go to shame is dropping and dropping and dropping.
Yeah, boy, is that true. Well, you've got it. So, David, you don't need me, David.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
You definitely don't. Speaking of that, David, tell me exactly what time it is.
It is 3:07.
Okay.
You gotta go?
Well, there's someone out there at 3, but let's see if I can answer any last questions.
Okay, let's go to timing.
Okay.
All right. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in drawing out is that when we look at all these different time precarious dimensions of the assembly of reading, we've got the visual tracking stuff that Rainer's showing.
From every step of the way.
Every step of the way. Generally.
Attention, vision, orthography, phonology, semantic, retrieval, articulation.
All of these things have to co-implicate.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
With a certain periodicity of refreshing the next cycle.
That's right.
Or the thing breaks down and crashes.
That's right. So timing can be a function of one piece of the circuit, or it can be a cascading effect of that on the rest.
Or a weak cycle frequency.
Exactly. And what causes that? I don't know, but I hope I do before I die.
Yeah, you and me both.
I really think, because there is no question that in some of our double deficit kids that are so slow, they are slow, and I'll bet if I had the ability to really trace it, I'll bet they were slow in almost each component, if not each component. Now, there's another person that you may want to talk to, and her name is Svea Breznitz, Breznitz, from Haifa, Israel, who is studying through ERPs the differences between visual and auditory processing rates, and she's finding a mismatch, that there's a discrepancy between the way they should work together in time and the way they do.
That's exactly right. That's my greatest interest is at this level is the synchromesh that's happening between all these different planes that have to co-implicate, and its correspondence to working out the artificial forms of ambiguity in this code.
Well, you know what? I'm so intrigued by that. It's not that I know as much as Svea, but Svea is really pursuing that, and you should at least email her. She's at University of Haifa, and also Chuck Perfetti was thinking along similar lines at one point, though it's Svea who's actually studied it and seen it in the Evoke Potential work.
Fantastic. Well, I'll follow up with her.
Definitely. Tell her hi.
I will. I will. It's been a delight to talk with you.
Well, David, for me too. Now, what is your background? Because you know so much.
I'm a learner. My main thing is that I've been on the track of what I call stewarding the health of our children's learning. I think that's the central organizing principle that can unite a lot of different dimensions of work, in that I really believe that the health of our children's learning is the most important thing for us to bring forth.
I couldn't agree more.
And so I've always, for the past 20 years, I've been looking at what is it that's obstructing, what is it that's a fundamental impediment to the health of their learning, not what they're learning about in particular.
Right.
That's how I came to reading late, when my own children had reading troubles.
Yeah.
So, and the more that I've understood the dimensions and the history and the code and what happened to English in the 15th century and the economic arguments of Coleman and the the Todd Risley work and what have you, the more I'm convinced that we need to have a social reframe in how we think about this.
Oh, I'm all for it.
Complete social reframe.
I'm all for it. I got in that way.
Okay, well, that's where we're together, and that's what my mission is. That's what we're doing here.
I can't wish you more luck on it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm going to be in touch about arranging a video interview if I can do that, okay?
That'd be great.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Bye.